everyone! Today, we dive into one of the most dramatic turning points of World War II, the years 1942 to 1943. For the first time since the war began, the unstoppable Axis powers started to stumble. And for the Allies, this was the moment hope returned. When 1942 began, Japan seemed invincible. In just a few months, their forces had swept across Asia and the Pacific, raising their flag from Hong Kong to the Solomon Islands for the Allies. Each headline felt like another defeat waiting to happen. But then, everything changed, not with a massive army on land, but with the hum of aircraft carriers out at sea. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea began, the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never actually saw each other. Aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of kilometers apart, searching, striking, and vanishing into clouds. Neither side could claim a clear victory. But for the first time, Japan's advance had been stopped. Just 1 month later came Midway, the moment that turned the Pacific War on its head. American codebreakers uncovered Japan's plans and set a trap. When Japanese planes took off to attack, U.S. dive bombers struck their carriers instead. Four of Japan's proud flagships were sunk within minutes. Midway was more than a battle, it was a psychological earthquake. Japan lost its best pilots and carriers in one blow, and for the first time, the rising sun began to fade. Then came Guadalcanal, a small, jungle-covered island that no one had heard of became the center of the war. For 6 months, American and Japanese forces fought day and night in mud, heat, and fear. When it was over, Japan had lost tens of thousands of men and the initiative forever. By early 1943, the Pacific belonged to the Allies. Island by island, they would begin their slow, relentless march toward Japan, a journey that had just begun. While the Pacific burned blue, the sands of North Africa glowed red. Here, the desert fox, General Erwin Rommel, had become a legend, a commander who seemed to outsmart, outmaneuver, and outfight everyone who faced him. By mid-1942, Rommel's tanks were rolling toward Egypt. If he reached the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to Asia would be cut. The Allies were desperate until a new face arrived. Bernard Law Montgomery, a British general with a calm mind, sharp discipline, and one absolute rule: no retreat. He reorganized, retrained, and waited, letting the enemy exhaust themselves in the heat and sand. Then, in October 1942, it began, the Second Battle of El Alamein. Over 1,000 tanks roared across the desert. The night sky flashed with fire, and the ground shook like thunder. It was chaos. But this time, the chaos had a plan. After 12 days of relentless fighting, the Axis lines cracked. Rommel, once the hunter, was now the hunted. His army retreated west, chased by British armor rolling forward under a cloud of dust. The news exploded across the world. Winston Churchill stood before Parliament and said,
"This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning."
Within months, Operation Torch brought American and British troops onto the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. By May 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, 250,000 men. For the first time in the war, the Allies had cleared an entire front. North Africa was over. The desert, once a graveyard of hope, had become the first stepping stone to Europe. In the summer of 1942, all eyes turned east. The German army, confident after a year of conquest, launched a new offensive deep into the Soviet Union. Its goal, the city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. For Hitler, Stalingrad was more than a city. It was a symbol, a name that carried the weight of pride and politics. To take it meant to humiliate Stalin himself. But the city refused to fall. The Luftwaffe bombed it to rubble, yet the Soviets turned the ruins into fortresses. Every street became a front line, every building a battleground. The fighting was brutal. Soviet soldiers joked darkly that they owned half the kitchen, and the Germans owned the other half. It was a war fought room by room, wall by wall. Then came the cold. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees. Food ran out. Ammunition froze. But the Soviet spirit did not. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack aimed not at the city itself, but at the weaker Axis forces guarding its flanks. It was brilliant, and it worked. Within days, the trap snapped shut. Over 300,000 Axis troops were surrounded inside Stalingrad. The hunters had become the hunted. As winter deepened, desperation set in. The trapped army starved, froze, and waited for an order to retreat. But that order never came. In February 1943, their commander surrendered. It was over. The once invincible German 6th Army was gone. The myth of Nazi invincibility shattered forever. Stalingrad was more than a victory. It was revenge, redemption, and rebirth. From the ashes of a dying city, the Soviet Union had turned the tide of the entire war. After Stalingrad, the Axis powers were reeling. The myth of unstoppable conquest had been broken. But they weren't finished. Not yet. In the summer of 1943, they tried one last great offensive at a place called Kursk. It was the biggest tank battle in human history. Over 6,000 tanks grinding through dust and fire. The German plan was to pinch the Soviet front in a giant pincer, cutting it in two. But the Soviets knew. They had been waiting. For weeks, they had built defenses, trenches, mines, anti-tank guns, layer after layer. When the attack came, it was like ramming into a wall made of steel and courage. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the German offensive collapsed. From then on, the Eastern Front would never move west again. Meanwhile, in the south, another front was opening. The Allies had taken North Africa and now looked north to Europe itself, their first target, Italy. In July 1943, Allied forces landed on the island of Sicily. It was the beginning of the end for Mussolini's regime. By the end of the month, he was overthrown and arrested by his own people. The Allies pressed on from Sicily to mainland Italy. Germany rushed to take control, turning Italy into another battlefield. But the message was clear. The Axis was breaking apart from within. By late 1943, one truth was undeniable. The Axis had lost the initiative. The Allies were coming from the deserts, from the skies, from the seas. The war was far from over, but for the first time, its ending seemed possible. The world had changed, and the tide had turned.